in China says UK is outward-looking but focused on national interests. European Commission says bloc no longer Washington's primary center of gravity at the European Defense Agency's annual conference in Brussels. Plus, US President Donald Trump warns Iran time is running out as US military builds up in the Gulf region. Let's begin the world today. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has arrived in China for a three-day visit, the first time a UK Prime Minister has visited the country since 2018. Mr. Starmer, who is traveling with around 60 British business and cultural leaders, will meet President Xi Jinping and develop trade ties. After arriving in Beijing, the PM told the delegation that the UK is resolute about being outward-looking and always being absolutely focused on national interests. Speaking on the flight to Beijing, Mr. Starmer said the trip will bring benefits for people back home. Analysts believe the trip is a bid to win favor with Chinese President Xi Jinping amid Europe's ongoing turbulent relationship with US President Donald Trump. The visit also comes following similar moves by Finland, Canada and France, and just a week after the US threatened more tariffs on the UK and others in the huge row over Greenland. And back home, Mr. Starmer was accused of going cap in hand to China for a trade deal and abandoning any previous criticism of Beijing, including alleged spying during a session of Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy subbed in for the absent Starmer, who landed in Beijing hours earlier. Liberal Democrat MP Daisy Cooper accuses the British Prime Minister of going cap in hand to China to ask for a trade deal on the promise of a super embassy from which she says the Chinese regime will use to continue to spy on the UK. However, the Deputy Prime Minister has responded that China matters and ignoring them would be a dereliction of duty. He adds that the UK will build a consistent long-term and strategic approach grounded in reality. This past month, Mr. Starmer finally greenlit long-delayed plans for the so-called Chinese super embassy in London. The US said it was deeply concerned about adversaries exploiting the critical infrastructure of our closest allies, while the government claimed that it was content that any risks are being appropriately managed. The green light was widely reported to be an attempt to keep China on side ahead of his trip.
The Chinese regime still holds British citizen Jimmy Lai captive in prison. And whilst the Chinese regime continues to hunt down pro-democracy protesters on the streets of Britain with bounties on their heads, the British Prime Minister has gone cap in hand to China to ask for a trade deal on the promise of a super embassy from which the Chinese regime will continue to spy on us. The Chinese regime remains undeterred in its illegal actions against the UK and our citizens. So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister to name one single consequence that the Chinese regime will face if they do not stop their campaign of espionage and repression?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, China matters, and ignoring them would be a dereliction of duty. We will build a consistent, long-term and strategic approach grounded in reality. I set that out in the China audit statement I made a few months ago, and that is what our allies do. President Trump, Macron, Chancellor Merz, Prime Minister Carney, all are visiting and engaging. We'll cooperate where we can, and I'm sure in areas like climate, she would expect us to cooperate, and we will challenge in areas where we disagree. That's the way that we deliver for the public of this country.
Daisy Cooper.
Elsewhere in Europe, the European Union Foreign Affairs Chief Kaja Kallas has warned of a growing divide between the United States and Europe, acknowledging that the EU is no longer Washington's primary strategic focus. Speaking at the European Defence Agency's annual conference in Brussels, she said Europe must adjust to what she describes as a long-term shift in global power dynamics. Footage from the event also drew attention, showing Kallas delivering her remarks in front of a row of empty chairs beneath the slogan, "To be ready together." In her address, she stressed that while transatlantic ties remain important, Europe must face new realities. She also said the United States will continue to be Europe's partner and ally, but added that Europe is no longer at the center of Washington's strategic priorities, a change she describes as a structural, not temporary.
Fundamental reorientation is going on across the Atlantic, a rethinking that has shaken the transatlantic relationship to its foundation. Let me be very clear. We want strong transatlantic ties. The US will remain Europe's partner and ally, but Europe needs to adapt to new realities. Europe is no longer Washington's primary center of gravity. The shift has been ongoing for a while. It is structural, not temporary. It means that Europe must step up. No great power in history has ever outsourced its survival and survived. These developments put a severe strain on the international norms, rules, and the institutions enforcing them that we have built over 80 years. The risk of full-blown return to coercive power politics, spheres of influence, and world where might makes right is very real. Since we last spoke here, the virus has started to spread. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney hit the nail on its head in his own speech in Davos. It's time also for Europe to take down its sign, to acknowledge that this tectonic shift is here to stay and act with urgency. We need to inject a sense of urgency into our efforts in 4 areas. The first, and arguably most important of these, is defense. We need the capabilities to deter and defend. You all know the diagnosis. There is lack of complementarity of capabilities in Europe. We are too focused on national interest to tackle fragmentation in a serious way. We must also strike the right balance between innovation and traditional systems. Warfare is evolving fast. Capabilities that are used today might be outdated tomorrow. We need to put our militaries in a position of strength. Or put simply, we must be able to win the fight tonight and be ready tomorrow.
Well, the U.S. interest in Greenland is not new with the Trump administration. This has been a posture of several previous U.S. presidents. Our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird, spoke with veteran award-winning journalist Marvin Kalb on the next steps in the U.S. interest in Greenland and the potential geopolitical impacts.
Professor Kalb, Marvin Kalb, American journalist, foreign relations expert, we thank you so much for joining, as we know that this is very interesting times in our American history, not just as the media covers this, but just in our American history. Tell us a little bit about the U.S.'s position in Greenland. If this is a national security concern, we know the president has had his eye on this, and we know that he will continue to focus in on the U.S.'s position there.
Well, you know, the United States has been interested in Greenland for a long time. When the U.S. picked up Alaska from Russia back in 1867, there was talk in Washington at that time of picking up the other side of Canada, as it were, Alaska on one side, Greenland on the other. But they never did it, I think because of money. They didn't want to spend the money. It was picked up again as a theme by Theodore Roosevelt, the early part of the 20th century. Again, it was raised, but it was not really pursued. And then Donald Trump came along and picked up the idea really that all of the Western Hemisphere ought in some way or another to be America's. And so this has a great deal more to do with just Greenland. Trump has already made it clear that he has in mind Cuba. He has already made his move on Venezuela. He has talked about Panama. He has talked about Canada. He has a vision in his mind that is very broad and totally unrealistic. But that is where we are at the moment. He has already said a couple of things about Greenland that could justify, confuse the rest of the world. He has spoken about using military force to take Greenland. He has spoken about buying Greenland. He's now in this vague place of negotiating military bases on Greenland. Now, perhaps he doesn't know, perhaps no one has told him, that the United States already has a very large military base on Greenland since World War II. And the Danes, who are the custodians of Greenland, have said, if you have something larger in mind, talk to us. Well, at the recent Davos meeting, the president had a serious, long conversation with Mark Rutte, the head of NATO. And out of that came not a clear statement in any way, but an end to talk about an American military seizure of Greenland, and something rather vague in the president's mind about getting more military bases there, searching for certain earth minerals that he's obsessed about. But do we have a clear policy about what we're going to be doing tomorrow or next week? The answer is no, we do not. We're in a state of confusing ourselves, NATO, and the rest of the world with what it is that is going to happen. And perhaps as a final thought on this issue, we ought to bear in mind that American foreign policy today is not a structured, organized series of concepts that fit into a broad scheme about what is in America's national interest, what will we fight for, what are we really interested in? No. What we have at this point is a highly personalized foreign policy. Whatever it is that is in the president's mind at any time becomes the foreign policy of the United States. Now, that's not the way it's been. And I should say, it's not the way it should be. Because it is all dependent on one person. And that is not a national policy, that is a personal policy.
You bring up some very key points here, and I want to focus a little bit on the meeting in Davos. And obviously, we all saw the speech that he gave there. And obviously, you mentioned minerals, which has also been touted as his interest in helping Ukraine and ending the war with Russia and Ukraine. What minerals is he exactly seeking, and what minerals will be of a benefit to the United States?
The exact minerals, I cannot tell you. I cannot tell you. I have already seen lists that go on 10 to 15 different minerals. Those minerals have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. The discovery now of the value of these minerals has to do with the new technology that we are caught up in. Now, whether it's a Zoom session, as we are having now, or whether it is an AI enhanced session, all of that takes us into technology way beyond my capacity. But I do know that because it is beyond my capacity, I'm not going to be talking definitively about it, nor is anyone else. There are very few people who really understand AI, what it is going to do, where it can move forward in a positive way. What are the problems? We don't know that. But somebody has talked to Trump and pointed out to him that it is extremely important for the US because we were way ahead of people on Zoom capacities, for example, on AI at this particular point. That if you want to continue to be ahead of everybody, and what we're talking about there is really China. If you want to be ahead of China, you have got to have a secure, locked-in access.
Very interesting conversation. Our Washington, D.C. correspondent, Maria Bird, speaking to veteran journalist Marvin Kalb about the U.S. interest in Greenland. Well, there's more from the U.S. President Donald Trump, who has warned Iran that time is running out to negotiate a deal on its nuclear program as the United States continues to build up military forces in the Gulf. Mr. Trump says a massive armada is moving rapidly towards Iran, describing a large U.S. naval force advancing with what he called great power, enthusiasm, and purpose. Iran responded through its mission to the United Nations, saying Tehran remains ready for dialogue based on mutual respect and interests. However, the statement warns that if Iran were pushed, it would defend itself and respond like never before. Iran continues to insist its nuclear program is entirely peaceful and has repeatedly denied seeking to develop nuclear weapons. President Trump's latest warning follows his recent comments on unrest in Iran, where demonstrations earlier this month were met with a severe and unprecedented crackdown. And still to come on the program. Fireworks light up sky over Petersburg, marking 82nd anniversary of lifting of siege of Leningrad. Stay with us for details. Welcome back. Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara has met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow as the Kremlin moves to secure the future of its military bases in Syria. The talks follow an earlier meeting in October, their first since the ouster of Moscow ally Bashar al-Assad last year, where both leaders struck a conciliatory tone. During the meeting, President Putin praises al-Shara for progress towards restoring Syria's territorial integrity after Syrian forces retook large areas from Kurdish groups. But tensions remain. Russia continues to shelter Bashar al-Assad and his wife, a key sticking point, with President al-Shara repeatedly pressing Moscow for their extradition. At the same time, Mr. al-Shara is strengthening ties with the United States as President Donald Trump praises the Syrian leader as highly respected and says relations are improving. Well, the EU is strengthening its ties with partners around the world as tensions in transatlantic relations grow under the Trump presidency. In Africa, it has been pushing for greater access to raw materials and deeper cooperation. And on Tuesday, Brussels signed a free trade agreement with India. DW correspondent Chiponda Chimbelu joins us with more on this. Chiponda, how significant is the EU-India free trade agreement?
It is very significant. The EU is India's biggest trading partner, and India is the bloc's 11th biggest trading partner. Now, this deal will, of course, then lift trade restrictions for the 2 billion people living in both the European Union and India. And this is why the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called this free trade agreement with India the mother of all deals. This is, of course, a response to the current global environment. We've seen, of course, the U.S. tariffs and more export restrictions from China. And all of that has brought the EU and India closer. But the deal does go beyond trade. Brussels and Delhi also announced a defense and security partnership on Tuesday. So there's a lot more going on there. But it is, of course, worth noting that this deal still needs to be ratified. And, of course, it isn't the only one that the EU has been working on.
And which other trade deals, Chiponda, has the EU been working on?
Well, there is, of course, also the European Union's free trade agreement with Latin America, the Mercosur trade deal, which was actually signed on January 17, and that has, of course, also been in the news. However, that agreement has now hit another roadblock after 25 years of negotiations. The European Parliament is yet to formally vote on the deal. Last week, of course, on Wednesday, we saw EU legislators voting to send parts of that agreement to the European Court of Justice for a legal check. Now, while the free trade agreement with Mercosur countries in Latin America does have support in the bloc, there have been a lot of critics, especially among farmers. There have been many farmer protests because of fears that Europe could be flooded with cheaper and less regulated agricultural products from Latin America. So, of course, while the EU is looking to deepen ties with other partners and regions, getting those deals done hasn't and isn't going to be easy.
And what more should we expect as Brussels pushes to diversify its global partnerships?
The European Union already has preferential trade agreements with 76 countries, and it has also been pushing for greater access to raw materials and deeper cooperation in Africa as well. And on top of that, it is also considering joining this so-called comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a free trade bloc of a dozen Asia-Pacific countries and the UK. And there's, of course, also the free trade agreement with Australia that has been in negotiations for years as well. But there have been disagreements over agricultural products there as well, much like with the Mercosur deal with Latin America. But that is, of course, something that we didn't see with India. For that, there was more of a concern in India, where agriculture is a major employer. Still, it is, of course, worth noting that this EU-India free trade agreement does really show that the old global trading order is gone and the realignment is already happening, with the EU pushing for partnerships with other countries and regions around the world.
Right, Chiponda, thanks again. Elsewhere now, the wife of South Korea's ousted former president has been sentenced to 20 months in jail for accepting bribes from the controversial Unification Church. However, the court cleared the 52-year-old Kim Kon-hee on charges of stock price manipulation and receiving free opinion polls from a political broker before the 2022 presidential election, which her husband, Yoon Suk-yeol, won. On Wednesday, Judge Woo In-sung at the Seoul Central District Court ruled that Kim had misused her position as a means of pursuing personal gain. Her husband, Yoon, has already been sentenced to 5 years in jail for abusing power and obstructing justice in relation to his failed martial law bid in 2024. This marks the first time in South Korea's history that a former presidential couple are convicted at the same time. The fourth India Energy Week is underway in Goa as global policymakers, industry leaders, innovators and investors come together to shape the future of the energy sector amid geopolitical uncertainty and accelerating climate action. Delegates tour the international company pavilions, attending panel discussions and engaging with new and emerging energy technologies. Participants highlight the growing focus on renewable energy and India's push for energy independence, with speakers stressing the need for affordable and economically viable alternatives. Experts also underline India's ambitions to strengthen its industrial supply chain ahead of its 2047 development goals, pointing to advances in technology, communications, transportation, and energy exploration. And finally, huge fireworks display lit up St. Petersburg night sky to mark the 82nd anniversary of lifting of the siege of Leningrad. Locals in the Russian city watched the pyrotechnics over the Peter and Paul fortress and the Neva River. The siege of Leningrad began on September 8, 1941, when Nazi forces encircled the city, cutting it off from supplies and reinforcements. On January 18, 1943, the Red Army succeeded in breaking the blockade during Operation Iskra, opening a narrow land corridor. The siege was fully lifted more than a year later on January 27, 1944. Lasting 872 days, the siege remains one of the longest and deadliest in modern history, with estimated civilian casualties ranging from 600,000 to 1.5 million. And that's the world today. Thank you so much for watching. On our programming note, up next on our DSTV platform is a Kogi State documentary on impact of the Ododo government. Sports news will run on our other platforms. Please stay with us.